We invite you to stay tuned for the live broadcast of the Wednesday evening Bible study of the Mayfield Drive Baptist Church, located at 271 Mayfield Drive, Smyrna, Tennessee. We will now join the service.
You don't hear it, but All right, it's good to be back this evening for our Wednesday evening Bible study here at Mayfield Drive Baptist Church. We are continuing on our study of the church history through the Trail of Blood. What this means is that we are studying church history, but we're using the Trail of Blood, written back in the 1930s by Dr. J.M. Carroll. We're using that as our base. And so we've detoured from it a few times, and we'll again before we're completely finished with this study. But some of the things that I want to cover in more detail are brought out in this lesson. And this is religion in the United States. We now come to the final lecture that Dr. Carroll gave in his series, The Trail of Blood. I think I've skipped one. If I have, then we'll go back. I'll go back and get it. This may be 17 instead of 16. So anyway, be that as it may, we'll get it all covered one way or another. So this final one is entitled Religion in the United States. All right, we'll then consider the final church of Asia that depicts this particular era of church history after we finish his last lecture. But we want to continue with the Trail of Blood now in religion in the United States. Through the Spanish and others of the Latin races, the Catholics, as religionists, came to be the first representatives of the Christian religion in South and Central America. So, your word is religionists. But in North America, except Mexico, they have never strongly predominated. And Mexico, they still are. I may have told this when I did the original series several years ago. But when I was 16, I think I was, I went to Old Mexico, spent about 6 weeks down there. And Brother Isaias Varricas Sr. was a Mexican missionary based in Monterrey. And he had been a missionary, a Mexican missionary, for many, many, many years. And so I would go with him as his driver while I was down there. And so we went to visit his mother way out in the Lord knows where. But I don't remember the name of the village. But he told me when we left, and that's where I learned, Jeremy, to don't question what you eat. Just eat it and go on. But anyway, and I pulled a few strings and what have you out of the meat that we had. So anyway, when you're in a foreign country, don't worry about what you're eating. Just eat it and don't worry about it. Let the Lord take care of it. And be thankful you've got it. Yes. But anyway, when we were leaving his mother's home, what? Oh, yes, I know. Our producer's rushing me along here. He told me, he said, this village, the people in the village got stirred up with a Catholic priest, by a Catholic priest. And there had been a Baptist missionary in that village, and they rose up against him and killed him. And this was in the 20th century. Now, this was back in the 60s, late 60s that I was down there. But it was in the 20th century that it happened. And it still happens today. Mexico is a very predominant Catholic religion. However, we have a very strong, large missionary Baptist work in the nation of Mexico. And we've had missionaries there for, I don't know how long, many years. Brother Rodriguez had been there in the late 60s when I was there. He had been there on missionary almost all his life there. So Mexico is still predominantly Catholic, but there's a lot more there than there used to be. In the territory of what is now the United States, except in those sections which were once parts of Mexico, they have never been strong enough, even during the colonial period, to have their religious views established by law. Now, they've stirred up a lot of trouble, but they have never been able to say, okay, this is state church, all right? Beginning with the colonial period in the early part of the 17th century, the first settlements were established in Virginia, and a little later in that territory, now known as the New England states, colonial period. Religious, or more properly speaking, irreligious persecutions in England and on the continent were at least among the prime causes which led to the first settlement of the first United States colonies. In some of the groups of immigrants which first came, not including that first Jamestown group in 1607, and those known as the Pilgrims in 1620, were two groups, one at least called Puritans. These were actually Congregationalists. Governor Endicott was in control of their colony. The other group were Presbyterians.
Okay. I put which blanks there were going to be. Brother Joe put the blank in there as to how long the blank was. So abbreviate. Getting him.
Among these two groups, however, were a number of Christians with other views than theirs, also seeking relief from persecution. Though these refugee Congregationalists and Presbyterians established different colonies, and immediately within their respective territories established by law their own peculiar religious views. In other words, Congregationalism and Presbyterianism were made the legal religious views of their colonies. This is to the absolute exclusion of all other religious views. You couldn't have another, sort of like Saudi Arabia is now. It's against the law to believe anything except the Islamic religion in Saudi Arabia. Themselves fleeing the mother country with the bloody marks of persecution still upon them, and seeking a home of freedom and liberty for themselves, immediately upon being established in their own colonies in the new land and having the authority, they deny religious liberty to others and practice upon them the same that they had received. The southern colonies in Virginia, North and South Carolina, were settled mainly by the adherents of the Church of England. The particular views of the church were made the established religion of these colonies. So you've got now at least three major religions that have done this. They've done the same thing that they fled from, and they turn around and institute the very same thing that they had been fighting against. Thus, in the new land of America, where many other Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and Episcopalians, now in case you wonder, Church of England and Episcopalians are the same. It's the Church of England is in England, Episcopalian is the American version. They have come seeking the privilege of worshiping God according to the dictates of their own consciences. There were soon set up 3 established churches. When they say established churches, that's a state church. No religious liberty for any except for those who held governmental authority. In other words, in those areas, if you were Baptist, you didn't count. Their own reformation is yet from complete. With the immigrants to America came scattering Baptists, by some still called Anabaptists. And there were probably some in every American-bound vessel. They came, however, in comparatively small groups, never in large colonies. They would never have been permitted to do that anyway. But they kept coming. Before the colonists are thoroughly established, the Baptists are numerous and almost everywhere. Excuse me. But they soon began to feel the heavy hands of the 3 state churches. For the terrible offenses of preaching the gospel and refusing to have their children baptized, opposing infant baptism, and other like conscientious acts on their part, they were arrested, imprisoned, fined, whipped, banished, and their property confiscated, etc., etc., etc. All of that here in America. Dr. Carroll says, from many sources I give but a few illustrations. Before the Massachusetts Bay Colony is 20 years old, with the Congregational as the state church, they passed laws against the Baptists and others. The following is a sample of the laws. It is ordered and agreed that if any person or persons within this jurisdiction shall either openly condemn or oppose the baptizing of infants, or go about secretly to seduce others from the approbation or use thereof, or shall purposely depart the congregation at the administration of the ordinance, after due time and means of conviction, every such person or persons shall be sentenced to banishment. Now, this law was enacted especially against the Baptists.
Does that mean like banished from the country?
No, from the outside the colony. And you'll see in just a minute why banishment was such a problem.
That's why we have the Dixon Island name, saying that's the same laws.
Yeah. By the authorities in this colony, Roger Williams and others were banished. Banishment, here you go. Banishment in America those days was something desperately serious. It meant to go and live among the Indians. In this case, Williams was received kindly, and for quite a while lived among the Indians, and in after days proved a great blessing to the colony which had banished him. He saved the colony from the destruction by this same tribe of Indians by his earnest entreaties in their behalf. So in this way, he returned good for evil. Roger Williams later, together with others, some of whom at least had also been banished from that and other of the colonies, among them was John Clark, a Baptist preacher, decided to organize a colony of their own. As yet, they had no legal authority from England to do such a thing. But they thought this was a step wiser under existing conditions than to attempt to live in existing colonies with the awful religious restrictions then upon them. So, finding a small section of land that was yet unclaimed by any existing colony, they proceeded to establish themselves on that section of land that's now known as Rhode Island. That was in the year of 1638. 10 years later, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but it was about 25 years later, in 1663, before they were able to secure a legal charter. In the year 1651, Roger Williams and John Clark were sent by the colony to England to secure, if possible, legal permission to establish their colony. Now imagine having to go all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to get permission to live where you want to in the new country. When they reached England, Oliver Cromwell was in charge of the government, but for some reason he failed to grant their request. I'm sure you've heard much about Governor Oliver Cromwell in studying world history. All right? But when they reached England, Oliver Cromwell was in charge of the government, but for some reason he failed to grant their request. Roger Williams returned home to America. John Clark remained in England to continue to press his plea. Plea. He didn't give up. Year after year went by. Clark continued to remain. Finally, Cromwell lost his position, and Charles II sat upon the throne of England. While Charles is regarded in history as one of the bitterest of persecutors of Christians, he finally, in 1663, granted that charter. So Clark, after 12 long years of waiting, returned home with that charter. So in 1663, the Rhode Island colony became a real legal institution, and the Baptists could write their own constitution. That constitution was written. It attracted the attention of the whole wide world. the whole wide world. And that Constitution was the world's first declaration of religious liberty. And we have our our American Baptist forefathers for bringing about religious liberty first in the world. The battle for absolute religious liberty, even in America alone, is a great history within itself. And we're going to look at some of that. It would be impossible to look at all of it, but we're going to look at some of it. For a long time, the Baptists seem to have fought that battle entirely alone. But they did not fight it for themselves alone, but for all peoples of every religious faith. Rhode Island, the first Baptist colony, established by a small group of Baptists after 12 years of earnest pleading for permission, was the first spot on earth where religious liberty was made the law of the land. That is not taught in schools. You are correct. The settlement was made in 1638. The colony legally established in 1663. In this colony, 2 Baptist churches were organized even prior to the legal establishment of the colony. As to the exact date of the organization of at least one of these 2 churches, even the Baptists, according to history, are at disagreement. All seem to be agreed, however, to the date of the organization of the one at Providence by Roger Williams in 1639. As to the date of the one organized at Newport by John Clark, all the later testimony seems to give the date at 1638. And I want to pause right here for a moment. Our lineage does not come through Roger Williams. He called himself a Baptist, but he wasn't like any kind of Baptist that we are, and we were. Okay? So he really wasn't a Baptist at all. You dig into the history of Roger Williams and you'll see that he never was a Baptist. All the earlier seems to give it later, some years later. The one organized by Roger Williams at Providence seemed to have lived but a few months. The other group by John Clark at Newport is still living. At least it was in the 1930s. Yes?
By chance, did you find out that it's still called the Newport Church? By chance, did you look up on the internet to see if it was still viable?
No, but that's a good idea. I didn't have time at the time to do that, but to the best of my knowledge, it's still alive. But don't quote me. I'll have to look it up to make sure. Dr. Carroll says, my own opinion as to the date of the organization of the Newport Church, based on all available data, is that 1638 is the correct one. And that does make sense that John Clark, already being a Baptist preacher, would have started a church as soon as they could. That makes sense.
Dollar General popping up.
Yeah. Dr. Carroll says, personally, I am sure this date is correct. Now, as to the persecutions in some of the American colonies, we'll give a few examples. These are the most prominent ones, I believe, that Dr. Clark hits on.
Brother Joe,
Yes, sir.
that's the United Baptist Church John Clark Memorial at First Baptist Church, Newport. The current meeting house of the church was constructed in 1846, so it's still going.
So it's still alive. Whether it's a true church anymore or not would be questionable. But it's recorded that on one occasion, one of John Clark's members was sick. The family lived just across the Massachusetts Bay Colony line and just inside that colony. John Clark himself and a visiting preacher by the name of Crandall and a layman by the name of Obadiah Holmes, all three went to visit that sick family. While they were holding some kind of prayer service with that sick family, some officers of the colony came upon them and arrested them and carried them before the court for trial. It is also stated that in order to get a more definitive charge against them, they were carried into a religious meeting of their church, Congregationalist, their hands being tied. Remember that. So the record states. The charge against them was for not taking off their hats in a religious service. Now remember, their hands were tied behind them. How were they to do it? Well, they were all tried and convicted. It was a setup, yes. Governor Endicott was present. In a rage, he said to Clark, while the trial was going on, "You have denied infants' baptism." And this was not the charge against them. "You deserve death. I will not have such trash brought into my jurisdiction." The penalty for all was a fine or be well whipped. More like a beating than a whipping. Crandall's fine, a visitor, was £5, which was at that time equal to $25. Clark's fine, the pastor, was £20, at around $100. Holmes' fine, the records say that he had been a Congregationalist and had joined the Baptist. So his fine was £30 or $150. Clark's and Crandall's fines were paid by friends. Holmes refused to allow his fine paid, saying he had done no wrong, so was well whipped. The record states that he was stripped to the waist and then whipped with some kind of special whip until the blood ran down his body and then his legs until his shoes overflowed. The record goes on to state that his body was so badly gashed and cut that for 2 weeks he could not lie down. So his body could not touch the bed. His sleeping had to be done on his hands or elbows and knees. How uncomfortable. Of this whipping and other things connected with it, Dr. Carroll said, I read all records, even Holmes' statement. A thing could hardly have been more brutal. And here in America. Painter, another man, refused to have his child baptized and gave his opinion that infant baptism was an anti-Christian ordinance. For these offenses, he was tied up and whipped. Governor Winthrop tells us that Painter was whipped for reproaching the Lord's ordinance. In the colony where Presbyterianism was established religion, dissenters, Baptist and others, seemed to fare no better than in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where Congregationalism was the established religion. In this colony was a settlement of Baptists. In the whole settlement were only 5 other families. In other words, besides the Baptists. The Baptists recognized the laws they were under and were, according to the records, obedient to them. This incident occurred. It was decided by authorities of the colony to build a Presbyterian meeting house in that Baptist settlement. Now that is blatant, what's the word I'm looking for?
Discrimination.
Pardon?
Discrimination.
Yes. Yes. And worse than that. I mean, it's blatant. I mean, in your face. Well, yeah, you Baptists don't, you have this section, but hey, we Presbyterians are in charge, so we want to build a church there. The only way to do it seemed by taxation. The Baptists recognized the authority of the Presbyterians to levy this new and extra tax, but they made this plea against the tax at this time. Quote, "We have just started our settlement. Our little cabins have just been built, and little gardens and patches just been opened. Our fields are not cleared. We have just been taxed to the limit to build a fort for protection against the Indians. We cannot possibly pay another tax now." This is only the substance of their plea. The tax was levied. It could not possibly be paid at that time. So an auction was called. Sales were made. And this gets even worse, more blatant than their cabins and gardens and patches and even their graveyards were sold, but not their unopened fields. Property valued at 363 pounds and 5 shillings sold for 35 pounds and 10 shillings. Yes, that's almost literally stealing it.
That's 10%.
It is. Some of it, at least, was said to have been bought by the preacher who was to preach there. Go figure. The settlement was said to be left ruined. A large book could be filled with oppressive laws. Terrifically burdensome acts of taxation, hard dealing of many sorts, directed mainly against the Baptist. But Dr. Carroll says, but these lectures cannot enter into these details. If I can, I will try. In the southern colonies throughout the Carolinas, and especially Virginia, where the Church of England held sway, persecution of Baptists was serious and continuous. Many times their preachers were fined and imprisoned. From the beginning of the colonial period to the opening of the Revolutionary War, more than 100 years, these persecutions of Baptists were persisted in. Yes.
What he's saying is that the Baptist persecution was great and that the Baptists persisted. They kept on, irregardless of what was done to them.
Yes. And all that time, persecution against Baptists was carried on.
And they just kept on keeping on.
We give some examples of the hardships of the Baptists in Virginia, and yet strange as it is, may now seem Virginia was the next place on earth after Rhode Island to adopt religious liberty. But that was more than a century away yet. But the hardships, as many as 30 preachers at different times were put in jail with only one charge against them: for preaching the gospel of the Son of God. Yes.
But I wonder how many people were saved and drawn closer to the Lord because this happened. Because you know, when there's persecution, it only makes things for God's people to grow. It doesn't make it to diminish. It only makes it grow.
That's true.
It doesn't give history of that. How many people were saved and baptized and brought to the church to? How many more preachers were dedicating their life to do God's work by preaching?
Right. Yes. Yeah, we don't see that. And nothing is much said about that. James Ireland is a case in point. He was imprisoned. After imprisonment, his enemies tried to blow him up with gunpowder. That having failed, they tried to smother him to death by burning sulfur under his windows at the jail. Failing also in this, they tried to arrange with a doctor to poison him. All this failed.
What did he do?
He was put in jail for simply preaching.
Just doing what we're doing now.
Right. He continued to preach to his people from the windows. I always chuckle when I read this. A wall was then built around his jail so the people could not see in nor he see out, but even that difficulty was overcome. The people gathered. A handkerchief was tied to a long stick, and that stuck up above the wall so Ireland could see when they were ready. The preaching continued. 3 Baptist preachers, Lewis, and he doesn't give the first name, Joseph Craig and Aaron Bledsoe, were later arrested on the same charge. One of them, at least, was a blood relative to R.E.B. Baylor, and possibly of one or more other Texas Baptist preachers. At that time, they were all Southern Baptists. These preachers were arraigned for trial. Patrick Henry, hearing of it, though living many miles away, and though a Church of England man himself, rode those miles horseback to the trial, volunteered his services in their defense. Great was his defense. Dr. Carroll says, I cannot enter into a description of it here. It swept the court. The preachers were freed. So in conclusion this evening, because of the length of this particular lecture by Dr. Carroll, I will conclude it in the next presentation. The persecution did not stop for the Baptists even when they entered the land of freedom. I am thankful that all of these early Baptists remained faithful to the Lord and his teachings.
Brother Joe, it's interesting, this information that I've heard, I never heard any of this until Florida Baptist Schools. I never heard any, and I'd been going to Baptist church since the sixties, you know. And it's kind of like where we are in America. Our new generations have no idea about our history, so look what's happening.
Yes.
And I think because our Baptist people today, they don't know the history, they have no problem with dropping the name Baptist.
Right.
We got a mess.
Yes, we do.
We got a big mess.
And it will not get better.
It's going to get worse.
It's going to get worse.
And this James Ireland, like James said, you never heard about that, so we
Yeah.
tried to blow him up with gunpowder, I mean, come
Simply
on.
because he's preaching.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're getting arraigned for preaching the gospel of the Son of God, what else are you supposed to preach in a church? In a Christian church?
Amen.
Honestly, it's the first 4 books.
Yeah.
Well, what happens is even today, they avoid those subjects.
Yeah.
It's going to offend somebody.
Yeah.
So basically, persecution's still going on.
Well, no, they're also going to preach how you're supposed to be loyal to the church.
Mm-hmm.
And, even if it means, they said that, infancy baptism was going against Jesus' word. But I don't remember him saying anything about that. But they're going to believe what they want to believe. And the people who are probably his, supporters of the court are all going to be like, yeah, what the preacher said, or, whatever what the father said, whatever. So, people that are on trial don't have a voice.
No.
Right.
There's-
Right.
Forget the evidence.
It's interesting, when you start reading about the Salem witch trial,
Oh, yeah.
it was the Baptists that were trying to go against that.
Yeah.
And it was the same thing, it was rumors that was going on. And these innocent people had not a word they could even,
Yeah. All they can do is confess to being a witch.
well, the thing about it is, then even if they confessed, then they had to dunk them and they died anyway.
Yeah.
Yes, it did.
In a horrific manner.
There's a lot of Baptists killed in the Salem witch trials.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes, there was.
Yep.
Yes.
And we'll try to look at some of that.
Yes.
All right. Any other comments or questions?
It'd be interesting if you could.
You've been listening to the live broadcast of the Wednesday evening Bible study of the Mayfield Drive Baptist Church in Smyrna, Tennessee. We invite you to tune in at the same time next Wednesday evening for another live broadcast of the Wednesday Evening Bible Study. We would love to see your comments regarding this broadcast. You may email us at imbr@imbmpodcast.com. That's imbr@imbmpodcasts.com. Or you may write to us at International Missionary Baptist Radio, P.O. Box 1676, Smyrna, Tennessee 37167. That's International Missionary Baptist Radio, P.O. Box 1676, Smyrna, Tennessee 37167. Thank you for listening, and may you have a blessed day.